Funerals and burials are a very important part of British life and an intrinsic part of our society. As the centuries have passed, we now, thankfully, live longer, healthier and fuller lives than our previous ancestors did. Mind you, the simple fact is that no matter how hard anyone tries, nobody is going to escape the Reaper forever. Sorry, you're just not. Funeral rites are as old as the human race, and in most cultures the deceased are memorialised in some way. In most villages and towns across the UK, cemeteries or churchyards are where we choose to lay our loved ones to rest. Whilst that might be a pretty standard thing, not all graves are the same, and neither are the slabs of stone we use to mark them. Have you ever wondered, therefore, why do we have headstones? To understand that, we first have to understand the word tombstone, from which the modern headstone developed. Like many things ancient, we have the Greeks to thank. Tombstone derives from the Greek words timbos, meaning burial mound, and stia, which means pebble. A tombstone, then, is literally a burial mound pebble. The use of stones on a burial mound is a tradition that goes right back to 2000 BC in the UK. We have Stonehenge, after all, which is perhaps the most renowned ancient gravesite in the world. Before the time of cemeteries, though, people buried their loved ones near their family homes and marked the burial spot with wood or piles of rocks. The use of the word tombstone was first recorded in England in 1560, but back then it was a reference to the lid of a coffin, not to any sort of grave marker. That would come later, in 1711. You see, the earliest stones had a different purpose. They were placed over the body of the deceased in order to prevent them rising from the dead, and/or keep them safe in the ground. Eventually, tombstones would become headstones, standing upright, literally at the head end of the burial. This began when church cemeteries began to replace personal burial grounds, and larger vertical tombstones began to be used instead. These originally were made of slate and then sandstone, both of which were relatively easy to carve inscriptions into, like names and dates, for example. Slate or sandstone markers are generally the oldest graves you'll find in a churchyard today. Often the inscriptions will have worn away now, but for those you can still read, it's rare that any display a date that's before the mid-1700s. Floor slabs, though, inside churches are often older, because of course they're covering the entire grave. In some places you'll find graves which are still completely covered. Chest tombs, like this one, are good examples. Although they're usually hollow, empty structures, they do cover the entire burial, which is in the ground underneath. Today it's not common practice to cover whole graves with some sort of stone, but they do exist, even in this very churchyard. In many Christian cemeteries, most graves will be found facing east to west. That's an old custom which originates from the sun worshippers of pagan times. Early Christians also adopted it because they believed this allowed the dead to be facing Christ on the day of the resurrection. Nowadays, the words headstone and gravestone are used interchangeably and mean the same thing. The ones we use today come in an interesting variety of styles. They're sometimes seen as status symbols, depending on who the deceased was. Those who were wealthy enough could afford very large or decorative ones, whilst others were quite primitive in comparison. The tradition of carved headstones dates back to Victorian times, but not everyone could afford those. In some cases, grave markers took on a different form entirely, including simple wooden crosses. Using wood was the easiest thing for the poorest in society who couldn't afford stone. It's rare you see those now, but again, they do exist for those who like a simple burial. Some grave markers tell stories. How many times have we seen on TVI a churchyard or burial ground that has Commonwealth war graves, for example? Those are generally all the same style, shape and size, a much smaller grave marker designed to show not only who the person was, but what their role was in the armed forces. Sometimes they even have their own separate section in a churchyard. Of course, these days modern cemeteries often have cremation gardens too, where the ashes of the deceased are either scattered or buried in a container, which is then covered by a smaller marker. Just remember this though, no matter who you are or how much money you've got, your coffin's going to be more or less the same size as mine, and all of our grave markers will do exactly the same job.